My name is Eloise Mason. I am 34 years old, and I am currently sitting through the most expensive Thanksgiving dinner of my life. 14 relatives are packed around this table, their voices a dull roar under the flickering light of the chandelier. At the head of the table stands my father, Gerald. He raises a crystal glass of champagne, looking every bit the retired contractor king of his own small, petty empire. He looks me dead in the eye and tells the entire room that my sister, Marlene, is the family's only true success because she finally paid off her mortgage, while I'm just a failure throwing my life away in a rented apartment. But these hypocrites are blind to two things. 1. Marlene's paid-off house is actually drowning in a $340,000 secret mortgage. 2. My father stole $20,000 from my own inheritance just to keep her head above water. I have the paper trail right here in my coat pocket. Before I blow this whole facade apart, do me a favor. Comment and let me know which state you're listening from. Hit like and subscribe. If you've ever had your own flesh and blood, treat your sacrifices like trash. The air in Marlene's colonial-style dining room is thick enough to choke a horse. It's the smell of high-end vanilla candles, trying and failing to mask the scent of a dry, overcooked bird. Outside, the Ohio wind is whipping against the red brick walls, but inside, the heat is cranked up to a stifling 75 degrees. I sit at the very end of the table, the kids' corner, even though I'm a captain in the United States Army. Around me, the silver clinks against the fine china with a rhythmic, irritating precision. My relatives are nodding, their faces flushed with cheap wine and the intoxicating high of judging someone else. Gerald is still standing. He's a big man, built from decades of hauling lumber and barking orders on construction sites. He doesn't see a daughter when he looks at me. He sees a bad investment. To him, a person's worth is measured in square footage and deed titles. "Look at this place," Gerald says, gesturing to the crown molding and the linen tablecloth. "This is what adulthood looks like." Marlene understands. She knows that a Mason doesn't pay a landlord's mortgage. She's debt-free. She's got her roots in the dirt. Marlene sits there, her legs crossed, wearing a smile that looks like it was painted on in a factory. She's fiddling with the edge of her napkin, her eyes darting around the room to soak up the admiration. Across from her, my brother-in-law, Craig, is already sweating. He's trying to be the dutiful husband, but the beads of moisture on his forehead tell a different story. Then, the hammer drops. Gerald's eyes lock onto mine. They're cold, hard as the concrete he used to pour. "Marlene's done it," he says, his voice dropping into a low, guttural rasp that cuts through the table chatter. "She's settled, she's a homeowner. Unlike some people at this table who are still living out of a suitcase and signing lease agreements every 12 months. The room goes dead silent. 14 pairs of eyes swivel toward me. It's a coordinated ambush. My Aunt Doris looks away, embarrassed. My cousins smirk. They look at me like I'm a piece of faulty equipment that needs to be hauled to the junkyard. I don't flinch. In the Middle East, I've sat in Humvees while IEDs turned the world into fire and shrapnel. I've had men rely on me to get them home when the supply lines were severed. I've earned my scars in the dirt. A little verbal venom from a man who thinks a red brick house is a fortress? That's nothing. My back stays at a perfect 90-degree angle against the chair. I don't set my fork down. I don't let my hand shake. I slide the tines of my silver fork into a piece of the dry turkey, bring it to my mouth, and chew. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I swallow. The silence lingers, stretching out until it becomes heavy and uncomfortable. I can see Craig's hand trembling as he reaches for the wine decanter. He knows. He's the first one to realize that my silence isn't a sign of defeat. It's the silence of a predator waiting for the target to walk into the kill zone. Gerald expects me to cry. Or maybe he expects me to beg for a loan so he can lecture me about fiscal responsibility while he hands me a check from a fund he's already bled dry. He wants a reaction to validate his power. I give him nothing. Instead, I let my left hand drop beneath the table. I slide it into the inner pocket of my dark wool coat, the one I haven't taken off because the house feels like a trap. My fingertips brush against the sharp, crisp corner of a white envelope. Inside that envelope are 16 pages of cold, hard data. Credit reports, public land records from the county office, bankruptcy filings for a defunct construction supply company. It's a roadmap of their destruction. I feel a small, sharp tug at the corner of my mouth. Not a smile, just the grim satisfaction of a soldier who knows the enemy's flank is wide open. Gerald thinks he built this empire of red bricks on hard work and family values. He thinks he's the patriarch. He has no idea that the foundation is made of sand and stolen cash. To tear down a wall this high, you have to understand exactly how they laid the bricks in the first place. You have to find the crack in the mortar. You have to know where they hid the bodies. My mind drifts away from the clinking silver and the smell of vanilla candles. It leaves this stifling room and travels back through the rain and the sleet. It goes back to 3 weeks ago, to a Tuesday night when the first red flag dropped and I realized my own father had turned me into a ghost in my own family. In my father's world, the only Bible that matters is a land deed. To Gerald Mason, you aren't a real person until you own the dirt you stand on. Everything else is just noise. My 900 credit score? Trash. My thrift savings plan account overflowing with 20 years of disciplined savings? Invisible. Even the 6 medals sitting in a velvet box in my closet are nothing more than scrap metal to him. He spent 40 years pouring concrete and pounding nails into the Ohio suburbs, and he thinks that makes him the ultimate judge of manhood and womanhood. I remember 2 years ago. I just signed a lease on a high-rise apartment in the city. It had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the skyline that made me feel like I'd finally made it out of the dust of my childhood. I invited him to the housewarming. I bought the expensive steaks. I stocked the fridge with the heavy craft beer he likes. I sat there on my new sectional, watching the clock until the ice in the bucket melted into lukewarm water. The 6-pack stayed shut. At 9 p.m., my phone buzzed on the coffee table. One text. "That's not a home, Eloise. It's a box. Don't ask me to come celebrate a rental agreement." The words felt like a slap across the mouth. I stared at that screen until the light dimmed. Then I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and folded my cloth napkins into perfect, sharp squares. Military habit. If the world is falling apart, you make sure your corners are tight. I didn't cry. I just drank one of the beers and looked out at the city I'd paid for with my own sweat, knowing my father would never see it as anything more than a glorified hotel room. Then there's Marlene. Sunday afternoons at Marlene's house on Orchard Lane are the family's version of a victory parade. It's a 4-bedroom colonial with a manicured lawn and a red brick facade that Gerald probably helped pick out. Craig, her husband, is always out back by the grill, flipping burgers with a forced enthusiasm that makes my skin crawl. He's the perfect son-in-law because he's a builder, even if his business is mostly just a front for his own incompetence. Gerald spends those afternoons buried in Marlene's leather sofa, holding court. He spends half the time praising the crown molding he helped install and the other half taking shots at me. He'll look at my boots, the ones I keep polished to a mirror shine, and scoff. "Still wearing the government's shoes, I see," he'd say, his voice thick with a blue-collar arrogance. "When are you going to get a real life, Eloise? One with a lawn to mow?" Marlene just sits there, nodding. She wears these expensive cashmere sweaters and a plastic, industrial-strength smile. She plays the part of the golden child so well it's almost impressive. She's the backdrop to Gerald's ego. As long as she has that house, she's the winner. I'm just the gray shadow in a uniform, a ghost haunting the corners of their perfect brick-and-mortar dream. The real knife in the back came last March. I was at the base, the smell of industrial floor cleaner and jet fuel still clinging to my hair when Gerald called. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about my promotion. He spoke with the booming tone of a man delivering a royal decree. "I've made a decision," he said. "I'm releasing $80,000 from the family trust. I'm giving it to Marlene." I felt the air leave my lungs. 80,000? Dad, that trust was supposed to be for both of us. "She's used it to pay off her mortgage in full," he barked, cutting me off. "She's stable. She's got her roots down. She deserves to be rewarded for that. You? You're a nomad. You'd probably just blow it on another high-end rental or travel. Marlene is the one keeping the Mason name on a deed. I didn't argue. Rule number 1 in the field: don't waste ammo on a target you can't hit. I just listened to the dial tone after he hung up, my hand gripping the phone so hard the plastic groaned. $80,000. That was my mother's legacy. It was the safety net I'd never asked for but always assumed was there. And he'd handed it to the sister who already had everything just because she owned a set of keys to a house he approved of. I went back to work. I pushed the anger down into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my career. I had my independence. I didn't need his blood money. But then came September. I'd stopped by Marlene's to pick up some old boxes from the garage. She wasn't expecting me. I walked through the side door and into the kitchen. The house smelled like fake lemon zest and hidden debt. Marlene was in the pantry, but she'd left a pile of mail on the granite kitchen island. Right on top was an envelope, bright yellow, the kind that screams for attention. It had a logo for a subprime lender, the kind of place that charges 20% interest to people who are drowning. In bold black letters, it said, "Past due, final notice." My intelligence training kicked in before my brain could even process the shock. I didn't think, I just reacted. I memorized the account number and the lender's name in 3 seconds. Marlene walked in a moment later, her face going pale when she saw me standing near the mail. She lunged for the envelope like a cornered animal, flipping it over and shoving it under a pile of magazines. "Just junk mail," she said, her voice an octave too high. She gave me that stiff plastic smile. "Stupid credit card offers. They never leave you alone, right?" I looked at her. I saw the way her hand was shaking against the granite. I saw the fine lines of panic around her eyes. "Right," I said. My voice was as flat as a desert floor. I left the house with my boxes, but my mind was spinning. If the house was paid off, if Gerald had handed her $80,000 to clear the debt, why was a predatory lender sending her a final notice for a mortgage? I know some of you listening right now have been the black sheep, while the golden child got all the praise and the money. If you've ever seen through a family lie like I did, comment yes and tell me what state you're listening from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to help me bring this whole house of cards down. It's time we look at the real numbers. The wall was starting to crack. Marlene was hiding something, and Craig was sweating through his shirts for a reason. Gerald's Bible, that precious land deed, was starting to look like a book of fables. I just needed to find the rest of the pages, and I knew exactly where to start digging. The soldier in me knew. If you want to take down a fortress, you don't go for the walls. You go for the foundation. And Marlene's foundation was made of nothing but paper-thin lies. I got in my car, gripped the steering wheel, and felt the cold steel of my resolve lock into place. It was time to go to work. It is Tuesday night. A cold, relentless drizzle taps against the thin glass of my rental apartment window. The sound is like thousands of tiny needles hitting a drum. I sit at my kitchen table, the only light in the room coming from the harsh, blue glare of my laptop screen. It carves sharp shadows into the corners of the room, highlighting the bare walls and the single-packed rucksack by the door. I do not mind the emptiness. In the United States Army, you learn that space is just a luxury. It is the data you occupy that matters. I take a sip of my coffee. It is black, bitter, and has been cold for over an hour. The taste is foul, but the caffeine is a soldier's fuel. I do not need comfort right now. I need a target. My fingers hover over the keys. They do not shake. I have spent years in humid tents in the Middle East, triangulating enemy positions while mortar fire shook the earth beneath my boots. I have tracked supply lines through mountain passes where one mistake meant a body bag for a friend. Finding a financial trail in the suburbs of Ohio. That is not an operation. That is a chore. I open the web portal for the county recorder's office. In this country, people think their secrets are buried deep. They think a red brick house and a manicured lawn are a vault. They are wrong. The stupidity of people who live on credit is that they always leave a paper trail. They sign their names to lies and then file them in public records for the whole world to see, if the world knows where to look. I type the names: Holt, Craig A., and Marlene E. I hit enter. The browser loading circle spins for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a lifetime when you are waiting for the killing blow. The page refreshes. A list of documents appears in a neat, clinical column. I scroll past the original deed from 5 years ago. I scroll past the standard tax assessments. Then, I stop. Line 12. Recorded on August 14th. The words are plain. Cash out refinance, $340,000. I feel a small, sharp twitch at the corner of my mouth. August 14th. That was exactly 3 months after my father, Gerald, stood in his driveway and told me he had handed Marlene $80,000 of family money to clear her debt. He had called it a reward for her stability. He had looked at my combat boots and told me I was a nomad who did not understand the value of a home. I do the math in my head. It takes less than a second. The original mortgage on that colonial house was $260,000. If Marlene had used the $80,000 from the trust fund like Gerald claimed, she should have been sitting on a small, manageable balance. She should have been free. Instead, she had gone back to a subprime lender. She had leveraged every single brick of that house. She had pulled out $340,000 in cash. She did not pay off the house. She doubled down on the debt. I open a new tab. I navigate to the state business registry. I search for Craig's company, Holt Construction Supply. The result pops up in a bold, blood-red font. Status: dissolved. Filing date: January 15th. Reason: Chapter 7. Bankruptcy. The puzzle pieces lock together with the sickening click of a loaded magazine. The picture is complete, and it is uglier than I imagined. Craig had run his business into the dirt by the start of the year. Marlene had burned through my father's $80,000 gift just to keep the lights on and the pantry stocked with organic kale. When that ran out, they had mortgaged the roof over their heads to fund their middle-class facade. They were ghosts. They were hollow shells dressed in cashmere and linen, living in a house they did not own, driving cars they could not afford, all while Gerald pointed at them as the gold standard of the Mason family. They were not successful. They were just better at hiding the rot. I feel a wave of disgust wash over me. It is a physical sensation, like walking into a room that smells of stagnant water. These were the people who looked at my medals and saw scrap metal. These were the people who called my life a failure because I did not have a lawn to mow. I move the cursor to the print icon. Print all pages, I whisper into the empty room. The printer in the corner began to whir and groan. It was an old machine, but it was reliable. It began to spit out sheets of paper, one by one. 16 pages of cold, black and white evidence. I watched them slide into the tray. These were my bullets. I stood up, my back straight, my movements precise. I gathered the pages. I aligned the edges until they were perfectly square. I used a hole puncher, the sharp metallic snap echoing in the quiet apartment. I slid them into a white folder and snapped a heavy metal clip over the top. There was no explosion of anger. There were no tears. I felt the familiar, icy calm that comes before a mission. I was an executioner now, and I was just sharpening the blade. But as I stared at the folder, one detail remained stuck in my mind like a burr under a saddle. My father had told me he withdrew that $80,000 from the trust fund. But I knew that trust fund. It had been established 40 years ago by my grandmother, Ruth. She was a woman who did not believe in shortcuts. She was a woman who understood that money was a tool, not a toy. Gerald was the executor, but the rules of that trust were rigid. It was designed to protect the principal. It was designed to be a bridge for the next generation. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. How did a man like Gerald, who obsessed over rules and deeds, find a way to bleed a protected trust dry for one daughter while leaving the other in the cold? He did not have the authority to do it alone. I picked up my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I reached a name I had not called in 6 months. Ruth Mason. I looked at the clock. It was late, but I knew she would be awake. She was a Mason after all. We do not sleep when there is work to be done. I gripped the phone, my thumb hovering over the call button. The reconnaissance was over. It was time to talk to the woman who actually owned the bank. I pressed the button and waited for the dial tone, knowing that whatever she told me was going to be the final nail in the coffin of my father's dignity. My phone didn't just ring, it barked. Gerald's name flashed on the screen in aggressive block letters. I didn't say a word when I picked up. I didn't have to. Gerald doesn't do conversations. He issues commands from a high horse he built out of ego and stolen lumber. Marlene's place, Thanksgiving, 2 o'clock sharp, he growled. His voice had that familiar, overbearing rasp, the sound of a man who spent 40 years shouting over the roar of a construction site just to prove he was the loudest person in the room. I'm making a formal announcement regarding the will. I'm updating the distribution. Be there, Eloise, and for God's sake, dress like you actually have a career. Congratulate your sister on the house. Try to show some class for once. The line went dead before I could breathe. He wanted a performance. He wanted me to sit in the corner of that red brick lie and clap while he handed the keys to the kingdom to a woman who was currently burning the furniture to stay warm. He was going to change the will, cut me out completely to subsidize Marlene's rot. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck, my knuckles turning white against the worn leather. I didn't feel the sting of the insult this time. I felt the cold, hard weight of a mission objective. I turned the key and drove into the gray Ohio sleet, but I wasn't heading home. I was heading to the only person left in this family who still remembered what the truth felt like. Grandma Ruth's house is a small gray shingled box on the edge of town. It is the opposite of Marlene's colonial facade. It is solid. It is honest. Inside, it smells like peppermint tea and the kind of heavy wax used on furniture that's built to last a century. Ruth was sitting at the oak table in the kitchen, her thin, sinewy hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. A countdown I hadn't realized was already running. I didn't dance around it. I sat down across from her, the 16 pages of financial evidence heavy in my coat pocket. I asked her about the trust. I asked her about the $80,000 Gerald had released to Marlene back in March. Ruth's tea mug stopped halfway to her lips. She froze. Her eyes, usually sharp and observant, turned to chips of blue flint. She set the mug down on the table with a sharp, ceramic click. 80,000? She asked. Her voice was thin, but it had the edge of a straight razor. Eloise, what are you talking about? Dad told me he withdrew it from the family trust, I said. My voice was flat, clinical. He said it was Marlene's reward for paying off the mortgage. He said the trust was being liquidated for her stability. Ruth leaned forward, her bony hands gripping the edge of the wood so hard the skin turned translucent. That trust only had $120,000 in it, Eloise. Total. That was the principal I set aside 40 years ago. It was supposed to be split down the middle. 60,000 for Marlene, 60,000 for you. Those were my standing orders to your father. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt thin, like I was standing on a mountain peak with no oxygen. My brain did the math before I could even process the betrayal. 80,000. If Gerald gave Marlene 80,000, he didn't just give her her share. He reached into the pot and took $20,000 that belonged to me. He didn't just favor her, he robbed me. I felt a cold electric shiver run down my spine. That $20,000 wasn't just a number on a ledger. 20,000 was exactly what I had earned in hazard pay during my last deployment. 20,000 was the price of every night I spent sleeping in a concrete bunker while the ground shook from incoming artillery. It was the price of the dust in my lungs and the scars on my hands. It was the money I had earned by putting my life on the line for a country that respected me more than my own father did. Gerald had taken my blood money and handed it to Marlene to cover up her bankruptcy. He had robbed his soldier daughter to fund his golden child's lifestyle, and he had lied to his own mother to do it. He stole it, Ruth whispered. The words weren't a question. They were a verdict. She slammed her hand down on the table, the tea in her mug splashing over the rim. The sound was loud, like a gunshot in the small room. She stood up, her movements stiff but full of a terrifying, silent rage. She didn't reach for her cane immediately. She leaned on the back of the chair, her eyes fixed on the sleet hitting the window pane. "He thinks I'm a senile old woman," she said, her voice shaking with a cold fury. "He thinks he can play games with my money and my granddaughters' lives because I stay in this house and keep my mouth shut." She turned to look at me. Her face was a mask of iron. "He wants to announce a new will on Thanksgiving. He wants to talk about inheritance and distribution." "Fine." She stepped toward the window, her silhouette sharp against the gray light of the storm. "You be there, Eloise. You wear that uniform. You hold your head up. Because I'm going to be sitting at that table too. I'm going to be right there in his line of sight. And I want to hear exactly how he explains where that money went." The grandfather clock in the hall struck the hour. A deep, heavy chime that echoed through the floorboards. The reconnaissance was over. The evidence was gathered. My father thought he was the one holding the gavel, but he was just a thief standing in a house of cards. I stood up and straightened my coat. I felt a strange, hollow calm. The pain was gone, replaced by the clinical focus of a predator. I knew the terrain now. I knew the enemy's weakness. "I'll see you at dinner, Grandma," I said. I walked out of the house and into the cold. The sleet was turning to snow, white flakes disappearing against the dark asphalt. The trap was set. Gerald wanted a celebration of his legacy. He was going to get a court-martial instead. 6 days before Thanksgiving, my phone hissed with the static of Marlene's speakerphone. I was in the middle of a logistics review at the base, looking at supply chains for 300 soldiers. I knew how to move fuel, water, and ammunition across a desert. I knew how to keep men alive. Marlene knew how to pick out throw pillows. "I have the menu handled, Eloise," she said. Her voice was high-pitched, vibrating through the tiny speakers. I could hear her kitchen faucet running in the background. "I am doing the garlic butter roasted turkey and the honey glazed ham, all the heavy lifting. I am giving you the salad. Just tear some lettuce and pour on the dressing. It is simple. No risk. I do not want you messing up the main course." It was not a request. It was a demotion. In the world of suburban power plays, the turkey is the throne, the ham is the court, the salad is the scrap you throw to the person you think does not belong at the table. She wanted me to know my place. To her, I was the nomad, the renter, the sister who did not have a red brick fortress to protect. She thought my life was a series of temporary stops, while hers was a monument of stability. "Fine," I said. My voice was as dry as the dust in a motor pool. "Great. And do not get fancy with the greens either, just the basic stuff. We want this to be a real family dinner." She hung up without saying goodbye. I stared at the dark screen of my phone. Later that afternoon, Gerald called to hammer the nail in. He did not ask how my week was going. He didn't ask if I was still dealing with the stress of the upcoming deployment. He spoke like a site foreman talking to a day laborer he was about to fire. "Thursday is a family day," he growled. I could hear the television blaring in his living room. "I want you to show up looking like you actually have a career. No boots, no uniform. Put on a dress. Act like a lady for once. Your sister poured her sweat and blood into that house. She's the reason we have a place to gather this year. You need to be ready to celebrate her success. Do not ruin this with your attitude or your military talk. Just be a guest. Celebrate her success. Celebrate the woman who had burned through my inheritance to buy a facade. Celebrate the woman who was drowning in $340,000 of secret debt while my father stole my hazard pay to keep her head above water." They wanted me to be the audience for their lie. They wanted me to sit in the corner, chew on cheap lettuce, and keep my mouth shut while they traded insults disguised as advice. The night before the dinner, the Ohio sky turned a bruised purple. The first heavy flakes of a snowstorm began to stick to the gray asphalt. I walked out of my apartment and climbed into Nolan's old pickup truck. The door creaked on its rusted hinges. The smell hit me immediately. It was a good smell: heavy canvas, sawdust, a hint of machine oil. It smelled like work. It smelled like the truth. Nolan sat in the driver's seat. His large calloused hands rested on the steering wheel. He was wearing a worn Carhartt jacket that had seen better days. He did not look at me at first. He just stared through the windshield at the streetlights flickering in the wind. "I have the folder," I said. I told him the whole plan. I told him about the county land records. I told him about the bankruptcy filing for Craig's supply company. I told him about the $20,000 Gerald had moved from my share of the trust. I expected him to tell me to let it go. I expected him to say that family is family, even if the core is rotten. But Nolan is not a man for empty words. He reached over and turned the key in the ignition. The old engine rumbled to life, vibrating through the floorboards and rattling the loose change in the console. "Whatever you decide to do, I am behind you," he said. His voice was low and steady. "I will be at that table. But I am telling you right now, I am not putting on a tie for those people. They do not deserve the effort of me trying to look respectable for them." He looked at me then. His eyes were tired but clear. He saw the captain. He saw the daughter who had been robbed. He saw the woman who was about to level a building. He did not offer pity. He offered a witness. When I got back to my rental apartment, the silence was absolute. I walked to my small desk and opened the drawer. I pulled out the 16-page financial report. The paper felt crisp and cold. I ran my thumb along the edge of the bankruptcy decree. Craig's company. Dissolved. Bankrupt. A failure. I did not feel anger anymore. Anger is a waste of energy in a combat zone. I felt the clinical precision of an officer preparing a briefing. I picked up the first page and folded it. Then the next. I moved with a deliberate, extreme focus. Each crease was a razor edge. I tucked the pages into a plain white envelope. No name on the outside, no return address, just a silent package of truth. I slid the envelope into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat. It sat right against my ribs. I felt the friction of the paper against the fabric, a soft rustle. It was the sound of a magazine being locked into a rifle. The location was set. The target was identified. The weapon was loaded. My father wanted a family announcement. My sister wanted a celebration of her brick-and-mortar dream. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. And then I was going to burn the whole thing down. I grabbed my keys and looked at the clock. The countdown had hit 0. It was time to go to Marlene's house. The colonial house on Orchard Lane is a pressure cooker. It's Thanksgiving morning, and the air inside is a sickening cocktail of expensive vanilla candles and the smell of a bird that's been in the oven 20 minutes too long. Outside, the Ohio sky is a flat, miserable gray. Inside, the heat is cranked up to a suffocating 78 degrees. It's the kind of heat that makes your skin itch and your collar feel like a noose. 14 of us are jammed around a table designed for 10. It's a minefield of gold-rimmed china and heavy silver. Every inch of the mahogany surface is covered in side dishes, but the layout tells the real story. Marlene and Craig are at the center, flanked by the successful cousins. Nolan and I are shoved into the far corner, right by the swinging kitchen door. My contribution, the cheap plastic bowl of salad Marlene ordered me to bring, sits at the very edge of the table, looking like an afterthought. An intruder. Craig is sweating. He's wearing a silk tie that probably cost more than his monthly electric bill, and his forehead is slick with a greasy shine. He's busy playing the host, pouring a cheap, bulk store red wine from a heavy crystal decanter. He thinks the glass makes the liquid taste like status. I watch him. I watch the way his hand tremors just a fraction when he catches my eye. He knows the foundation is rotting. He just doesn't know I have the blueprints to the collapse. 30 minutes in, the clatter of silver stops. Gerald stands up. He doesn't just stand, he looms. He's wearing a crisp navy blazer that looks like it belongs on a man who owns the neighborhood. He picks up his crystal glass and taps it with a fork. Clink, clink, clink. The sound is sharp, high. It cuts through the chatter like a razor through dry wall. The room goes dead. The only sound left is the low, electric hum of the refrigerator and the heavy thud of the heater kicking on. Gerald adjusts his lapels, his chest puffed out like a blue-collar king. He starts talking about legacy. He talks about the Mason name and the grit it takes to build something that lasts. His eyes drift to Marlene. They're full of a thick, heavy pride that makes my stomach turn. "I've spent my life building things," Gerald says, his voice a low rumble that commands the room. "And nothing makes me prouder than seeing my children understand the value of a roof." Marlene has done something few people her age can claim. She's reached the finish line: a red brick home, a manicured lawn, and a deed that's paid in full. No debt, no masters. That's what it means to be a Mason. Marlene tilts her head back, offering that industrial-strength smile. She looks like a trophy on a shelf. Then, the air leaves the room. Gerald's gaze swivels toward the end of the table. He locks onto my face, his eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits. The warmth in his voice vanishes, replaced by a serrated edge. "It's about maturity," Gerald growls, loud enough for Aunt Doris to stop mid-bite. "It's about roots. It's about building a fortress, not throwing your life away on a month-to-month lease. Some people at this table would rather throw their money out a window every 30 days and call it independence. That's not a life. That's just being a nomad with a suitcase and no future." 14 pairs of eyes hit me like a physical weight. I can feel the judgment. It's thick, heavy. It's the look you give a piece of machinery that's too broken to fix. My cousins smirk behind their napkins. Marlene looks down at her gold-rimmed plate, acting like she's embarrassed for me. They expect me to snap. They expect a scene. They're waiting for me to get up and walk out so they can spend the rest of the afternoon talking about how unstable the soldier has become. I don't give them a thing. I sit there, my back a rigid 90-degree angle against the hard wooden chair. I'm a captain in the United States Army. I've sat in rooms with people who actually had the power to kill me. This is just noise. Beside me, I feel Nolan's body tense. I can hear the air whistling through his nose. His jaws clamped so tight the muscles are bulging. He's ready to flip the table. He's ready to tell Gerald exactly what a man who steals hazard pay from his own kid is worth. I don't look at him. I just reach under the table and place my hand on his knee. I press down, firm and steady. Not yet. I pick up my fork. I stab a piece of the turkey Marlene bragged about. It's stringy and dry as sawdust. I put it in my mouth. I chew. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I swallow. It's like sandpaper going down my throat. If you've ever had to sit through a dinner like this, watching the person who robbed you get a standing ovation, comment "truth" below and tell me which state you're listening from. Make sure to hit like and subscribe. We're about to turn the lights on in this room. I pick up my linen napkin. I dab the corners of my mouth with the kind of precision I used to use for cleaning a sidearm. Every movement is calculated. Every breath is controlled. Gerald is still staring at me, waiting for a crack in the armor. He thinks he's winning. He thinks the silence means he's broken me. He has no idea he's just walked directly into the kill zone. I set the fork down. I don't drop it. I place it. The silver hits the gold rim of the china with a dry, hollow clack. The sound echoes in the quiet room. I look up. My eyes aren't angry. They're empty. I lock onto Gerald's face, and then I shift my gaze to Craig, whose hand is now shaking so hard the wine is sloshing against the side of the decanter. The coordinates are locked. The target is identified. I take a slow, deep breath, feeling the 16 pages of the report in my coat pocket pressing against my ribs. "Craig," I say. My voice is a low, flat line. "Pass me the turkey." The silence following Gerald's speech was thick, heavy, and tasted like the dry dust of a construction site. 14 people sat frozen under the warm glow of the chandelier, their eyes darting between Gerald's puffed-up chest and my motionless silhouette at the far end of the table. Marlene was still wearing that plastic, industrial-strength smile, basking in the glory of a lie that was about to go up in flames. I looked up. I did not look at Gerald. I did not look at Marlene. I locked my eyes onto Craig. My brother-in-law was already falling apart. He was hacking at a piece of ham, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His silk tie looked like it was choking him. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down his temple and disappear into the collar of his expensive shirt. "Craig," I said. My voice was a flat, level line of sound. It was not loud, but it cut through the room like a sniper's whistle. "Could you pass me the platter of turkey?" Craig flinched. He nearly knocked over his wineglass as he reached for the ceramic dish. His hands were shaking so hard the gravy was sloshing over the sides. He slid the platter toward me, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, desperate to avoid my gaze. "Thanks," I said. I did not take any meat. I just let the platter sit there between us. "By the way, Craig, while we are on the subject of foundations and houses, how is that $340,000 cash-out refinance working for you?" The sound that followed was the first explosion. Kang! The heavy silver fork in Craig's hand hit the gold-rimmed china plate with a violent, metallic scream. It bounced once and skidded across the mahogany, leaving a trail of grease before falling to the floor. Craig did not move to pick it up. He sat there, his mouth slightly open, his face turning the color of a concrete slab. The blood drained from his skin so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug. What did you just say?" Marlene stammered. Her voice jumped an entire octave. It was the high-pitched, frantic sound of a cornered animal. How could you possibly know?" She stopped herself. She realized what she had just admitted. She tried to cover it with a stiff, horrified laugh, but the damage was done. The golden child had just blinked. Gerald's glass of champagne stopped halfway to his lips. He frowned, his heavy eyebrows knitting together in confusion and dawning anger. He looked at me, then at Craig's ghost-white face. "What kind of trash are you talking now, Eloise?" Gerald growled. He tried to reclaim his position at the head of the table, but his voice lacked its usual booming authority. "Refinance. This house is paid off. Marlene is debt-free. I saw to that myself." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back slightly, my back still a perfect 90-degree angle against the chair. "The County Land Records Office has a very different story, Dad," I said. My voice was clinical, the tone of an officer delivering a post-mission briefing. "Document number 12, recorded on August 14th. That is exactly 3 months after you handed Marlene $80,000 of family money to clear the deed. They did not pay it off. They leveraged it. They took out a subprime loan for $340,000. They put a fresh mortgage on a house you thought was a fortress." Marlene erupted. She stood up so fast her chair screeched against the hardwood floor. "She is lying!" Marlene screamed, her finger pointing at me, her face contorting into a mask of pure, ugly spite. "She is just jealous. She is a nomad who hates that I have roots. She is making up family stories to destroy my reputation." I tilted my head just a fraction of an inch. "I did not make it a family story, Marlene. You did. You took our father's money he took from my inheritance, and you used it to play the role of the successful homeowner while you were drowning. It is public data. Anyone with a laptop and a brain can see it." Gerald turned toward Craig. He did not look like a king anymore. He looked like a wounded beast, his chest heaving under his navy blazer. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the crystal decanter jump. "Craig!" Gerald bellowed, the sound vibrating in the suffocating heat of the room. "Look at me. Where is the money I gave you? Where is the $80,000? Craig did not look up. He collapsed into himself, his shoulders slumping, his head hanging low over his empty plate. He looked small, defeated. A man who had run out of lies and oxygen at the same time. "It is gone, Gerald," Craig whispered. The room was so silent you could hear the snow hitting the window panes. "The business, Holt Construction Supply, it went under in January. We filed for Chapter 7. We used your money to pay the creditors, but it was not enough. We had to mortgage the house to keep the lights on. We lost everything months ago." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a deathly, freezing quiet that stripped the gold-rimmed china of its shine and made the expensive vanilla candles smell like rot. 14 relatives sat in a state of total shock, their eyes fixed on the golden couple who had just turned into ghosts. Gerald's face went from a fiery red to a sickly gray. He sat back, the air leaving his lungs in a long, ragged hiss. He looked at Marlene, the daughter he had worshipped, and saw a stranger. I sat there, my hands folded on my lap. I did not feel joy. I did not feel pity. I felt the grim satisfaction of a soldier who had just cleared a room of hostiles. The facade was gone. The red bricks were just clay. The Mason legacy was a pile of debt and stolen cash. But before Gerald could find his voice to scream, a new sound cut through the wreckage. From the very head of the table, a voice that was old, thin, but as heavy as a mountain, cut through the wreckage. "Gerald," Grandma Ruth said. Everyone turned. The 78-year-old woman was sitting perfectly still, her bony hands gripping the arms of her chair. She looked like a judge about to pass a final sentence. "I think it is time we talk about whose money you were really handing out," she said. The coordinate had shifted. The real trial was just beginning. Gerald stood frozen. He looked like a man who had just watched a bridge he built collapse into a river. His teeth were grinding together so hard I could hear the enamel popping. The shame wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical weight, pinning him to the expensive hardwood floor he'd bragged about all afternoon. But the real executioner was still sitting at the head of the table. Grandma Ruth cleared her throat. It wasn't a loud sound, but in that stifling, overheated room, it had the impact of a granite slab hitting the floorboards. "Gerald," Ruth said. Her voice was thin, but it carried the authority of the person who actually signed the checks. Gerald didn't turn to look at her. He couldn't. He just stared at Craig, who was still slumped over his gold-rimmed plate like a gutted fish. "That $80,000, Ruth continued, her eyes fixed on the back of Gerald's neck. "That was the principal from my trust fund. It was a legacy meant for both of my granddaughters. It was a safety net for their futures. I gave you the keys to that fund because I thought you were a man of your word. I thought you understood what it meant to be a Mason." Gerald's shoulders hitched. He looked like his navy blazer was suddenly 3 sizes too big for him. "I was trying to save the house, Ma," Gerald rasped. His voice was a broken, pathetic thing. "I was trying to keep us together." "You were trying to feed a lie," Ruth snapped. She slammed her palm onto the table. The crystal glasses jumped. "You took $20,000 that belonged to Eloise. You stole from a soldier who was sleeping in the dirt while you were sitting on this leather sofa. You reached into her pocket and handed her blood money to this girl so she could pretend to be a queen in a house she doesn't even own. You are a thief, Gerald, and you are a coward for hiding it from me." The room went cold. The 14 relatives who had spent the last hour smirking at me were now looking at their laps. Aunt Doris was staring at Gerald with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The King of the Hill act was over. The patriarch was just a con man who'd been caught robbing his own mother's purse. Gerald's jaw dropped. It hung open, loose and trembling. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He took a staggering step back, his hip slamming into the mahogany sideboard. A stack of expensive linen napkins fell to the floor. He didn't pick them up. His power, the iron-fisted authority he'd used to bully me for 30 years, was snapped in two. He looked at Marlene, then at me, and finally back at Ruth. He looked small. He looked old. He looked like a failure. I stood up. I didn't rush. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back with a slow, deliberate scrape that echoed through the silence. I stood tall, my back a perfect 90-degree angle, my eyes scanning the room like a tactical map. I didn't feel the heat of the room anymore. I felt the sharp, clean focus of a mission completed. I looked Gerald dead in the eye. He looked away. He couldn't handle the sight of the daughter he'd tried to erase. "I didn't come here to start a fight, Dad," I said. My voice was a low, flat line of steel. "I came because you ordered me to. Because you wanted a witness to your great family announcement. Well, consider me a witness. I am finished being the background scenery for your lies. I am finished being the nomad you used to make Marlene feel tall." Marlene started to sob. It was a messy, loud sound, full of self-pity and the realization that the credit card bills were finally due. She looked at me, her makeup streaking down her face. "Eloise, please," she choked out. "I don't hate you, Marlene," I said. I looked at her cashmere sweater and the secret mortgage papers hidden in her mind. "I just pity you. You've spent your whole life building a fortress out of sand, and now the tide is in. Good luck with the subprime lender." I reached for my heavy wool coat on the back of the chair. I slid it on, feeling the weight of the 16-page report in the inner pocket. I didn't need to show it to the whole table now. The truth had its own gravity. It had already leveled the building. Nolan stood up beside me. He didn't say a word to Gerald. He just gave the table a sharp, polite nod of his head. He looked at the crystal decanter of cheap wine and the dry turkey. And then he looked at me. He was the only person in that room who saw me as a person, not a data point. "Let's go," Nolan said. We walked toward the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't need the drama of a loud exit. I just opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the Ohio winter. The wind was a razor, cutting through the smell of vanilla and fake pride. It felt amazing. It felt like oxygen. We reached the old pickup truck. I climbed into the passenger seat, the smell of sawdust and machine oil wrapping around me like a shield. I took the plain white envelope out of my pocket and tossed it onto the dashboard. It slid across the plastic, coming to rest against the windshield. I didn't need to read the numbers again. I delivered a coordinate by mouth that had turned the Mason Empire into a pile of dust. I looked at the red brick house in the side mirror as Nolan started the engine. The lights inside were flickering, and for the first time in my life, that colonial facade looked exactly like what it was. A cage? Nolan shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb. The snow was falling harder now, white flakes obscuring the tracks we'd left behind. I didn't look back. The mission was over. The Empire had fallen. And I was finally headed home. 10 o'clock the next morning. The kitchen at Grandma Ruth's house didn't smell like a holiday anymore. The scent of overcooked turkey and fake vanilla had been replaced by the sharp, acidic bite of black coffee and the cold smell of damp wool. Outside, the Ohio sky was a flat, bruised purple, and the snow was piling up against the window frames. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic, metallic tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. Over and over. Gerald sat in the corner of the oak table. He looked like a man who had spent the night in a holding cell. His white dress shirt was yellowed at the collar, wrinkled and stained with sweat. The navy blazer from yesterday was gone, replaced by a cheap, pilled cardigan. He didn't look like the patriarch of Orchard Lane anymore. He didn't even look like a retired contractor. He looked like a shadow that had been caught in the light. Miller, the family lawyer, sat across from him. He was a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. He laid out the documents with a clinical, terrifying precision. 3 copies, single-spaced. Grandma Ruth sat at the head of the table. She didn't have a mug of tea this morning. She just had a fountain pen, a heavy silver thing that looked like a weapon in her gnarled hands. She looked at Gerald for exactly 1 second. There was no pity in her eyes, just the cold, hard clarity of a person who had spent 80 years watching people reveal their true colors. "Breach of fiduciary duty," Miller said. His voice was as dry as a desert floor. "By withdrawing funds for unauthorized personal use and failing to maintain the principal for the beneficiaries, you have forfeited your position as trustee." "This is not a debate, Gerald. This is a notification of removal." The only sound in the room was the scratch of the pen against the thick paper. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Ruth signed all 3 copies. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look for a reaction. She handed the pen to Miller, and then she looked at me. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest felt like it was starting to lift. The 40-year-old trust fund was being frozen. The $80,000 Gerald had stolen was being clawed back from the wreckage of Marlene's equity. My $60,000 and the $20,000 of my hazard pay he'd laundered through that colonial house was officially being restored to my name. Gerald finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. He didn't look at Ruth. He looked at me. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He spoke with a bitter, jagged edge, his voice cracking like dry wood. "You didn't have to do it that way, Eloise," he rasped. "You didn't have to humiliate me in front of everyone. You could have pulled me aside. You could have spoken to me like a daughter." I picked up my mug. The coffee was black and bitter. I took a slow sip, letting the heat burn the back of my throat. I didn't blink. I didn't let my back slouch. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I was looking at a man who had treated my life like a bad debt. You could have asked how I was doing, Dad, I said. My voice was a flat line. In 3 years, you never asked about my deployment. You never asked about the men I lost. You never asked if I was okay. Instead, you stood up in front of 14 people and called me a failure because I didn't own a set of red bricks. You turned my inheritance into a weapon to help your golden child lie to the world. You humiliated yourself the moment you touched my mother's money. I just turned the lights on. Gerald flinched. He looked like I'd hit him with a physical blow. He stared at the signed documents on the table, the reality of his removal finally sinking in. He was no longer the man in charge. He was just a guest in a house he couldn't control. He stood up slowly. His joints popped. He looked at Ruth, then back at me. He didn't have any weapons left. No deeds, no trust fund, no authority. He leaned on the table, his fingers trembling against the wood. "You know something, Eloise," he whispered. It was a small, petty sound. "You're just like her. You're exactly like your grandmother. Cold, hard, no room for family." It wasn't a compliment. He meant it to be a knife. But I just set my mug down and gave him a short, sharp nod. "I'll take that," I said. Gerald didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy and uneven. I heard the front door open and close. No slam. Just the soft, final click of a latch. He was gone. That afternoon, my phone started to vibrate on the counter. It didn't stop. It was a relentless, buzzing ghost. Marlene sent a text that was 3 pages long. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the bankruptcy. It was about her reputation. She talked about how the neighbors would look at her now. She talked about how cruel I was for ruining her Thanksgiving. She didn't mention the $20,000 of my blood money she'd spent on kitchen renovations. Then came a call from Craig. He left a voicemail, his voice thick with tears. He talked about family loyalty. He asked if I could talk to Ruth about loaning them enough to keep the bank from foreclosing on the house. He sounded like a man drowning in a puddle. I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I didn't even get angry. I sat on the edge of the bed in my small rental apartment. The room was quiet. The only light came from the gray Ohio afternoon. I opened my contacts. I went to Marlene's name. Delete. I went to Craig's name. Delete. Then I hit the block button. On both of them. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical sensation, like a heavy rucksack being cut from my shoulders. I breathed out, a long, ragged hiss of air that seemed to come from the very bottom of my lungs. The adrenaline from the last 3 weeks was finally gone, leaving behind a clean, empty space. The war was over. The mission was accomplished. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the snow fall over the city. I was still a nomad. I still didn't have a red brick house or a manicured lawn. But for the first time in 34 years, I knew exactly who I was. And I knew exactly who didn't belong in my life. I picked up my rucksack and started to pack. Christmas was coming. And I had a different kind of dinner to prepare for. 4 weeks. That is how long it took for the dust to settle on the wreckage of Orchard Lane. In the civilian world, they call it a scandal. In the Army, we just call it a successful demolition. The phone calls from Gerald had stopped. The long rambling emails from Marlene about family unity and reputation had been filtered into a folder I never intended to open. The silence was not empty. It was clean. It was Christmas Eve. The Ohio winter had finally bared its teeth, dumping 8 inches of heavy, wet snow across the city. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window pane of Grandma Ruth's kitchen. But inside, for the first time in 34 years, the air did not feel thin. It did not taste like a lie. There was no gold-rimmed china tonight. No silk ties or fake smiles. No 14 relatives squeezed around a table, waiting for a patriarch to tell them who was winning and who was losing. The kitchen smelled of real things. Rosemary, garlic, the deep, savory scent of a herb-roasted chicken browning in a seasoned cast-iron pot. It was a heavy smell, the kind that sticks to your ribs and stays in the room. I stood by the counter, watching the beeswax candles flicker. Their light was soft and yellow, casting long, gentle shadows against the white painted brick. The fire in the small wood stove popped and hissed, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I wasn't wearing a dress. I wasn't wearing a uniform. I was just wearing a thick wool sweater and a pair of jeans that had seen better days. I didn't feel like a nomad. I just felt like myself. Only 4 of us sat at the table. Grandma Ruth, looking smaller but somehow more immovable than ever. Nolan, his large calloused hands resting on the wood, the smell of sawdust still clinging to his flannel shirt. And Aunt Doris. She was the only one who had stood up and walked out of that red brick house 4 weeks ago, right after the truth hit the floor. She hadn't looked back then, and she wasn't looking back now. She was busy mashing potatoes, real potatoes, with the skin left on and plenty of butter. I moved toward the table to help, but then I stopped. In the center of the table, at the very head, there was a small piece of cardstock. It was handwritten in Ruth's sharp, steady cursive. Eloise. The card was sitting right where Gerald used to sit. The seat of the provider, the seat of the person who held the line. In the Army, position is everything. It tells you who leads, who follows, and who is expendable. For 3 decades, I had been shoved to the corner, squeezed against the kitchen door, given the salad, and told to keep my mouth shut. I had been the expendable one. I looked at Ruth. She was adjusting the napkins, her movements slow and deliberate. "I thought this was your spot, Grandma," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Ruth didn't look up immediately. She smoothed the fabric of the tablecloth with one gnarled hand. Then she looked at me, her blue eyes as clear as ice. "That is the spot for the person in the house," Ruth said. Her voice was thin, but it had the weight of a mountain. "It is close enough to the stove to grab more food, and it is close enough to the door to watch everyone's back. That is your spot, Eloise. You earned it. Sit down." I pulled the chair out. It was old wood, heavy and solid. It didn't screech against the floor like the chairs at Marlene's house. It moved with a dull, honest thud. As I sat, I felt the tension that had been coiled in my jaw for 10 years finally begin to unspool. I felt the invisible armor I had worn since I was a teenager, the armor I used to survive my own father, begin to fall away piece by piece. Nolan reached over and squeezed my hand. His grip was firm, a silent acknowledgement of the ground we had taken. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We were 2 people who understood that loyalty wasn't something you talked about. It was something you proved when the lights went out. Aunt Doris set the cast iron pot in the middle of the table. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was final. It was the sound of a mission completed. "To family," Doris said, her voice rough but kind. "The kind you actually choose." We ate in a way I didn't recognize. There were no insults disguised as advice. There were no boasts about credit scores or deeds or red brick empires. We talked about the snow. We talked about Nolan's new contract at the mill. We talked about the stories Doris remembered from when Ruth was a young woman. For the first time, I wasn't a data point. I wasn't a disappointment. I was just a woman at a table with people who actually knew my name. As the night wore on, I looked around the room. The scars in my mind, the ones Gerald and Marlene had spent years carving, felt cool. It was like someone had finally applied ointment to a burn that had been smoldering for a lifetime. I realized then that I didn't need their approval to be whole. I didn't need their permission to be successful. The United States Army taught me how to survive a firefight. It taught me how to move under pressure and how to hold a perimeter against an enemy who wanted me dead. But it took me 34 years to learn how to survive my own blood. I used to think that belonging was a prize. I thought it was something you worked for, something you earned by being the smartest, the strongest, or the most compliant. I thought if I just stood straight enough, they would finally see me. I was wrong. Belonging isn't a reward someone gives you. Belonging is what happens when you are strong enough to realize the chair they gave you is an insult. It is what happens when you finally have the grit to kick that chair across the room and walk out the door. I looked at the card with my name on it one last time before I blew out the candle. I wasn't a nomad anymore. I didn't need a red brick house to have a home. I had my own table now, and I was the one who decided who got a seat. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the snow bury the tracks of the world outside. The mission was over. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I turned off the light. The darkness was warm. The silence was mine.